I am seeing what we're doing this evening is not unlike gathering together in town meeting. Today or this evening, the thing we'll be talking about is the Electoral College, and which is a very contentious issue, particularly since the 2000 election, and then that controversy became even stronger in 2016. So, just like town meeting, people are going to have lots of different viewpoints on the Electoral College. And my job, I do have some opinions, but my job is to try and remain neutral and to see how we can draw out different points of view about this constitutional arrangement that we have for choosing the president and the vice president. So if you don't already have with you some paper and pencil, I would say run and go get something. It's going to be helpful as part of the evening's presentation. Ah, great. I already see one person. She's ready. Christina is showing. She's got others too. Connie, excellent. Very 20th century, I know, to ask you to have paper and pencil, but it may be useful for you to jot down some of the arguments that you hear for and against the Electoral College. Besides a pen and paper, something to jot some ideas down on, I highly recommend opening up your brain a little bit, particularly if you're somebody who has a very strong view on the Electoral College. I do recommend touching your brain before we get started. What that does, and feel free to turn off your cameras if you feel a little silly being in wherever you are, but if you can, just what you're trying to do here is what neuroscientists call opening up the deliberative pathways in your brain. Did you know you had such a thing? I didn't till I read this book. Great book. Brian Garston, Saving Persuasion. And he talks about if you take in many different arguments, that you will open up new deliberative pathways in your brain. I feel like that's a very important thing to say in the 21st century because a case could be made that because of the way we live now, we tend to be more isolated from each other. That is being intensified under COVID. It's very easy for our deliberative pathways to actually be reduced. We only hear what we believe to be true, and we don't hear other things. So, thank you for grabbing your brains a little bit and opening them up. The other thing I also recommend that you do is that you bring your hands to your ears and then let them go. And this very simple gesture is a way of realizing that sometimes you're going to want to have this, especially, okay, Electoral College is not as bad as some of our contentious issues, but you may hear something and you may feel like doing this. That's fine. Go ahead. But then also try that. It's very simple. We shut down, we open up. And that's what I see as the benefit of living in a democracy. It's hard work. It's not good for the nervous system all the time. It is a very fragile institution, fragile way of doing things, and it's probably a silly way of doing things. But it's good for our brains. So that's what we're going to be thinking about today. So, what I have planned for everybody is first, we're going to look at the Electoral College as it sits in the Constitution. It is a mechanism of the original Constitution. And then there was an amendment, the 12th Amendment happened pretty soon after the Bill of Rights, where there's a slight change in the language about the Electoral College. So, we'll go over that language. And then I'm hoping we'll be visited by Alexander Hamilton, known as a Broadway star, and also as one of those Federalists who wrote quite a bit about the Constitution and why it should be ratified. So after we've looked at the Constitution, we'll hear a little bit from Alexander Hamilton. And then I have just another more of an update on what's happening with the Electoral College so we can think about what it is. And then we're going to get down to the debate. This is a debate that I found on the Intelligence Squared website. I highly recommend. I think David Miller, who's here with us this evening, told me about this. It's a great resource if you want to hear any issue, any contentious issue, and they have lots of them in which you get to hear both sides of the argument. So we'll go over what that debate is, and then I'm going to send you off in that magical way we can in Zoom for small groups to consider the arguments on both sides of the question and to discuss them briefly, 12 minutes, in a breakout room to see if there was any overlap amongst the people in the group or whether everybody in your breakout group had a different idea. And then we'll come back, we'll have a little talk about what we discovered, and then I'll offer you two possible changes to the Electoral College that might be of interest to you. So that's pretty much the scope of what the evening will be. My guess is we will be out of here by 8:30, and I will be keeping track of the time. So I'm going to start some PowerPoint slides. So it's found in Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution. Not too surprising that it's in Article 2. That's where you can find out everything you ever wanted to know about the executive branch from a constitutional perspective. And in Article 2, Section 2, it describes how the president and vice president shall be voted in. Each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislator thereof may direct a number of electors equal to the whole number of senators and representatives to which the state may be entitled in the Congress. So we take the same calculations that we use, for instance, the state of Vermont, we have 2 senators and we have 1 representative right now. And so that would be an entitled of 3. But no senator or representative or a person holding an office of trust or profit under the United States shall be appointed an elector. You cannot be a member of Congress and be an elector. You cannot be a part of the administration and be an elector. Or it suggests be a contractor, perhaps, because this
under the U.S.
Oops, and we're getting something. Maybe Bill, if just sorry, if did somebody want to jump in right there? What did you wanted to say? Okay, I will take that as an excited utterance, and we will keep looking at this. Article Amendment, the 12th Amendment to the Constitution makes a slight change. The electors shall meet in their respective states and vote by ballot for president and vice president. So in case there was any confusion, where do these electors meet? They meet in their respective states. And here's a key piece, one of whom at least shall not be an inhabitant of the same state with themselves. This is why presidents and vice presidents may not reside in the same state because it's important for one of the candidates to not be an inhabitant of the state. So Alexander Hamilton, here he is in his glory. He wrote in Federalist 68 the reason why in Philadelphia they came up with this idea of the Electoral College. Alexander Hamilton, are you here with us this evening?
Yes, I am.
Oh, excellent. Let's see. Would you be willing to share part of Federalist 68?
Professor Mott, it would be my great pleasure.
Oh, thank
Federalist
you.
68. It was equally desirable that the immediate election should be made by men most capable of analyzing the qualities adapted to the station and acting under circumstances favorable to deliberation and to a judicious combination of all the reasons and inducements which were proper to govern their choice.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so we're looking that this is supposed to set up something favorable to deliberation. If you could read us one other part from Federalist 68.
Indeed, And as the electors chosen in each state are to assemble and vote in the state in which they are chosen, this detached and divided situation will expose them much less to heats and ferments, which might be communicated from them to the people, than if they were all to be convened at one time in one place.
Nice. One more.
And as I'm sorry.
Yeah.
The office of president will seldom fall to the lot of any man who is not in an eminent degree endowed with the requisite qualifications.
Thank you very much. Now, do you have any thoughts about this now, Alexander Hamilton? Like, did you feel like this is so important that people should be in a detached and divided situation?
I think that's reasonable. I think often when we want to think about something, we seek out a quiet place.
Nice. Absolutely. So this is exactly right. Thank you, Alexander Hamilton, for joining us, because this idea that people get very, very agitated if you have them all together. And if you want to think well, you might need a quieter place, not everyone all together. I don't know if any of you have had any success with making home brewed ginger beer, but this whole business of heats and ferments is something I discovered when I opened up some homemade ginger beer much too early. It was much too hot. And next thing I know, instead of peering down at a bottle, I'm staring at this pillar of golden brown. Where did it come from? I look up at the ceiling and there's an entire pond that is just expanding on the ceiling, which then all falls down on top of me. If you're going to talk about something that is controversial, perhaps even combustible, it can be a good idea to cool down, stay away from the heat, because when things get fermented, it can get very wild. Um, Now, this question about that the office of president will seldom fall to the lot of any man who is not in an eminent degree endowed with the requisite qualifications. My guess is this is going to be one of the things that we discuss this evening. Is this a successful safeguard? So, when Hamilton was writing, of course, the electors were men who were chosen, who were not fulfilling an office at the moment, but who were considered the sort of man who would be able to make a good decision about who should lead the country. In this book, and I highly recommend this, How Democracies Die, which was written in 2018 by two political scientists, Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. They point out, and this is a fascinating book about how demagogues and authoritarians often take over, not through military coups, but through the electoral process. And one of the things they consider is in the United States how demagogues and Hamilton, if you're interested in Hamilton's thinking on demagogues, you should look at Federalist #1, in which he says, okay, everybody, maybe this democracy will work, but maybe it won't. Because, as we all know, demagogues can easily seduce the masses into thinking they serve their own interests. So, something that Hamilton was concerned about, demagogues, continues to be a problem for all democracies around the globe throughout time. So they point to the Electoral College as fulfilling a gatekeeping function. But unlike in Hamilton's time, instead of electing local notables as delegates to the Electoral College, each state began to elect party loyalists. Electors became party agents. And maybe some of you here with us tonight served as electors for out of a state, probably because you were a member of either the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. And that these are the people who become the electors. And because of that change, say Levitsky and Ziblatt, the Electoral College surrendered its gatekeeping authority to the parties. It's the parties now who are in charge of making sure that demagogues do not get elected. So this is what the Electoral College looks like now. To give you a sense, there's Vermont up there. We have 3 because we have 3 delegates to Congress. We have 3 electors. 4 from New Hampshire. And you can see there's 2 states. One is Maine and Nebraska over here, in which it's not a winner take all electoral situation. It's proportionate. You can see also big changes like, wow, 38, 55, big numbers. Illinois, 20, Pennsylvania, 20, New York, 29. And it should, DC has 3 electors. Unlike in Congress, where DC representatives sit, but they don't actually vote, DC has electors. So that's what the Electoral College looks like on nowadays. And it also looks like this. This is a recent picture, which has taken on a lot more meaning given what happened soon after they brought in the electoral vote. So there they are in their ceremonial trunks being brought into Congress. They've already been certified by the states, and Congress on January 6th will count them. And so that gave you some sense of the Electoral College. And here's where we're going to get into some arguments. And this is from May 20th, 2020. The question before the debate, the debating audience is, has the Electoral College outlived its usefulness? We have 2 people on each team. On the affirmative, for those of you who are debaters, you know, like if you're on the affirmative side, that means you are supporting the proposition. Has the Electoral College outlived its usefulness? The answer is yes, you're on the affirmative team. And on the negative team, that means you're saying it has not outlived its usefulness. It's worth keeping. We have law professors on both sides and a New York Times columnist, Jamel Bouie, and on the negative, Tara Ross, editor of Texas Review of Law and Politics. So get your paper and pencils and pens ready, because all you need to do now is, as I start to present these arguments, is to pay attention. Which of these arguments do you find most compelling? Which of these arguments do you find least compelling? You may have right now a strong position. You're either on the affirmative or the negative. But for this exercise, I'm asking you to consider the merits of both sides. What did you find personally most compelling? And what did you find least compelling? So let's look at these. Affirmative arguments. We'll begin with Jamel Bouie, New York Times columnist. He says, the will of the voters is thwarted by an ill-considered 18th century electoral device. It accommodated the interests of slave states, which makes sense when you think about the calculations that were used in order to determine the number of seats a state has in the House of Representatives. Because of the 3/5 clause, there would have been more votes in the Electoral College for slave states. It has no place in a democracy that strives for a standard of one person, one vote. Why should one state have so much more importance than another, which means a lot of voters, particularly in places like California, which has got a big population, only 55 electoral electors, I should say that. There is no one person, one vote on the national election. So as far as Jamel Bouie is concerned, get rid of it. It's gone. And I wanted to show one map, and I'm going to show a map also for the negative side as well to give you a sense. Just to take a look at in 1860, the kind of extra seats slave states had, and also to point out how Vermont and New Hampshire in 1860 must have had a higher population because look at how they both have more seats. Vermont only has 3 right now. I think, is New Hampshire 4 or is it 3? But I don't think it's 5. So in 1860, there were more seats down there, but
New
does somebody?
Hampshire is 4.
New Hampshire is 4. Thank you, Brian. So you can see in 1860, there was a higher population, more electors. But the slave states did have their numbers boosted, and that was because of the 3/5 clause in the Constitution. This shows you how Abraham Lincoln squeaked out a win in that election. Another affirmative arguments saying that it's obsolete. Winner take all character makes it that only a handful of states matter in selecting the president. Swing states who get the most attention have populations that are older and more rural and on average whiter than the country as a whole. The Electoral College, therefore, exacerbates polarization and divisions, creates this distorted sense of the country and its political geography. So as far as Kate Shaw is concerned, get rid of it, take it out. And they have, if you go to the Intelligence Squared website, whenever they do a debate, they have this massive brief. So they only present certain arguments. These are the ones they presented in May of 2020, but they have lots more authority and arguments within their briefs. So I went into for each side, I pulled out an authority. And for the affirmative side, it is Eric Holder. Eric Holder, are you here with us this evening?
Yes, I am.
Thank you. Can you tell us what you think about the Electoral College?
I'd be glad to. Time to make the Electoral College a vestige of the past. It's undemocratic, forces candidates to ignore a majority of the voters and campaign in a small number of states. The presidencies are one national office and should be decided directly by the voters.
And what do you think about that still? Are you still behind this position?
I am, very much so.
Great. Is there anything you wish to add to what's been said?
Yeah, 2 things. I think that the most problematic aspect is how it undermines one vote per person. If you compare California with Vermont in terms of the Electoral College, Vermont gets 3.5 votes per person for each voter in California. And that's just an absolute distortion.
Right.
I feel less concerned about whether or not it's useful or not, but I feel very concerned that it undermines the democratic process.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Eric Holder. So I want to make sure for everybody, because this is your chance to write down, what did you think was important that you heard from the affirmative side? What was convincing? And which of these arguments did you find least persuasive? Okay, we are now going to move on. We've heard from the affirmative. We are now going to hear from the negative. And we will begin with Tara Ross. And she has the following arguments. The Electoral College, through Democratic electors, because at this point, as the authors of How Democracies Die already pointed out, the Electoral College is pretty much run through party agents. So the Electoral College, she says, through Democratic electors prevented segregationist George Wallace from winning in 1968. At the time he was running, he was receiving about a 40% approval rating, and it was through the Democratic Party and their efforts that he did not succeed in being their nominee. Now, that's not to say, so that when I'm talking about the Electoral College, it means that it's a way that the party is given a fair amount of authority who gets chosen. She says also that the Electoral College provides a balance of population and one state, one vote, not one person, one vote, one state, one vote. You can't win if you are catering to one faction. So that anybody who's trying to get through the Electoral College, they need to have their game on the ground in a lot of different states. And as she points out, those who do best are those who build a coalition. The only way you can become a president of the United States, she argues, is if you get people from different parts of the country who have different interests to get behind you. So she gives it a big heart. And just to show you what that looks like a little, I brought up this is from the Washington Post, just to give us a sense that those pictures that say they're red states and blue states are actually a little misleading. They make things seem far more potent when it's done by acres and not by population. So just to give you a sense of how the red and blue goes together, even up here in New England. And here from Bradley Smith, a law professor, he says, the winning candidate will need an appeal that extends beyond any one or two regions or broad social classes, and it avoids the catastrophic possibility of a national recount. Allows for local election rules tailored to local conditions. And they also bring in their authority, the person who they use to make their case. And for this negative team, it was Vernon Jordan. Vernon Jordan, that's hard to say. It's hard to say rural jury. Vernon Jordan, are you with us this evening? You may have to unmute yourself.
I sure am, Ms. Mott.
Thank you. Could you tell us what you think about the Electoral College?
Well, I think that the abolishment of the Electoral College inevitably means the formation of a Black political parties voting along racial lines and increasingly separated from the major parties who would themselves be weakened and dependent upon coalitions with splinter groups. This would not only weaken the political system, but would be a polarizing factor destructive of racial harmony.
Yeah, thank you, Vernon Jordan. You said that before Congress in 1979, when I guess there was a move to consider abolishing the Electoral College. Do you have any more to add to this? Like why you feel that this is really going to be important to keep it going?
Well, I think it's important because, united we stand. And I think that when we've seen recently how political parties, when the smaller groups are courted by the parties, that they can make change within those parties in the electing their candidates.
Right. Thank you. And we saw that with Jim Clyburn and the Biden candidacy. So certainly some of his concerns are continue to be playing out in American politics. Thank you very much. So let's go back. Just I want to make sure. I believe this is all that we have from the negative side. So let me go back to the beginning, just so that you have a sense. You're looking for you. Which of these arguments seemed most persuasive? Which of these arguments seemed least persuasive? Going back to seeing each other. So, because we have a big crowd here, we can't just have this conversation in one group. So through the magic of Zoom, we'll be able to create some breakout rooms. And what this means is, and maybe before we start that magic and send you all to different places across the island, does anybody have any like just questions or about what you're going to be doing in your breakout rooms? Basically, you'll get together, you'll share notes. What did you find most persuasive? What did you find least persuasive? Can you make a decision? What do you think? How would you vote as a group on the proposition? And then you'll have 10 minutes to do this, and then we'll come back and we'll find out about it. So, great. Looks like we got nodding. Yes.
Question. So do you mean most persuasive to each of us or
Yeah.
most persuasive to the country in general if there were a vote held?
Arlene, that's a great question. I'm wanting to know inside you what resonates most.
Okay.
So this is definitely you thinking for yourself.
Thank
What
you.
did you find most persuasive? Yeah. It's harder sometimes, isn't it, to imagine what the country will do. So yeah, you're just thinking about it for yourself. Awesome.
Meg,
Okay,
I
we're
have a
gonna
question.
yes, we have another question.
I do have a question. Is there anything in the Constitution or otherwise that says that electors are expected to vote consistent with the public vote in the state that they're in?
I believe there was recently a Supreme Court case that solved that problem. There was a question about a faithless elector who was going to vote based on, now I can't remember his or her conscience, and the Supreme Court. In some ways, this is contrary to Hamilton, who says, looking for a class of men who can make the right decision. They will have the best discernment. So I believe the Supreme Court has now said you need to follow the will of the voters. We'll definitely be talking about that more as we go forward. I'm hoping some of our lawyers here might be able to help us out with that, more details. There was one other question I heard?
Another
Yep.
related question, Meg,
Yes, Bob.
and that is, does the Constitution stipulate that it will be 2 months between the election and the time the Electoral College does its final vote?
That's a great question. And while you all are in breakout rooms, I will look over that to see. A lot of this is calendar specific, so I'll make sure I can get that language. Yeah. Okay, so let's try this. We're going to try this small group, and you'll be gone for 10 minutes. When something comes on the screen saying, would you join? Just hit join. And we'll just find out, like, what did people find persuasive and least persuasive? These were small little breakout rooms, so I'm hoping people had a chance to really talk about what they saw in terms of the arguments. I'm curious, and we may not be able to hear from everybody because it is a big group, but was there any group of any of the breakout rooms in which the 2 or 3 people in the room were like, yep, we all are on the same page? Is there any group that really felt like, yeah, we're all on the same page? We know what to do. Joyce. Yeah, Joyce, can you?
Yeah, I thought we were pretty much.
Yeah.
Seemed to be.
And how do you mind
Do you want to know
sharing,
what page
Joyce?
we were on?
Yeah, I want to know what page you're
No,
on.
that's fine. Well, we all found, I don't know if we all, but I mean, basically, and maybe if the other 2 that were with me, speak up if I misrepresent us, because it seemed like that we thought that the reasons for abolishing seemed more valid and understandable, where the reasons for keeping it, we weren't sure that those were valid reasons, or even if they were valid, really, I mean, in other words, was it really true that what they said were true, that that's the way things were,
Oh, wow.
or
So,
if they were, to buy into them. And,
So you
and we
didn't-
thought that having the House, yeah, go ahead.
so it sounds like
Question?
your group was pretty clear that you were with the affirmative, and that whatever the affirmative said, you thought was reasonable, but what the negative said, not so much.
Well, I think so. It wasn't real strong. I mean, we weren't
Yeah.
like saying, this way or no way, but
Yeah.
it felt like there was more things that made more sense to us on the left, and with the Senate and the House of Representatives being, 2 people, 2 senators per state, and then the House being proportion, that kind of took care of some of the issues related to, things not being fair. If they had, and we also said it doesn't actually fit the original description of what they should be doing anyway. It should be a few educated men or something voting, and now they say, well, you can't do that. You got to vote by the people. So it's not even using the original purpose that it was written for. We're not even using it the same way it was written to begin with. So
Got it.
we're not using it. So, that doesn't seem right either.
Excellent. All right. Thank you, Joyce. I have a hand up here, Bill. You may need to unmute yourself. What happened in your group?
Jack and I were relatively close about our thinking that the idea of Nebraska and Maine seems very equal, that the proportional voting would be more representative of what each state would offer. We were talking about in Vermont and that factoid that someone presented about Vermont has 3/5 of a vote and versus California. And that it was just the opposite of what I thought was the original intention to even out the electoral votes. I thought that it would favor the bigger states or balance, give the bigger states take some advantage from the bigger states. Didn't seem that way in terms of the fact.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, did you say that rather than abolish it or just keep it the way it is, that you thought, let's just change it a little bit, go with proportional representation and follow Maine and Nebraska's example?
Yeah, I heard a lot from Jack talking about a constitutional amendment. I'm not exactly sure whether that would be necessary. That might be something to consider. But that model of having proportional voting per state would at least balance out across the country we have an election where Mr. Biden received more votes than any other candidate before, and then Mr. Trump received the second number. And so I think that popular vote is kind of important to consider. That was our sense anyway.
Right. So one of the reasons to perhaps abolish it is because it doesn't conform. When it doesn't conform with the popular vote, spell. It misfires. When it misfires, that's a problem too. Let's see. Other groups that were completely united. Yeah, Lori Doolittle.
Yes, we had 4, and we were basically everybody was. It didn't even take any convincing. We were just all basically repeating what the others have said. And one of the gentlemen said at the end, I'm sick and tired of not having one man, one vote.
So the one man, one vote was very convincing.
Yes.
Okay. Interesting. Was there a group out there that was all for keeping it? Listen to the laughter. Audacious even thought. Yes.
Our breakout was only 2 of us.
Yeah.
And we were talked through it and agreed that we would probably keep the Electoral College.
Good. Yeah.
Primarily because the founding fathers, when they wrote the Constitution, had a choice of having a complete democracy where every person got a vote and you tally that up for the national offices.
Yeah.
And they made a conscious decision to use this moderating force, if you will, of the Electoral College to give each state, to give each state some additional say. We believe that's still important because, 8 or 10 population centers in the United States, if we have one person, one vote, 8 or 10 population centers in the US could drive every single national election. And then the national leaders that are elected in that process will then focus on those 8 or 10. And you'll have the rest of the country, Vermont, New Hampshire, many other states, with very little national representation.
Would sway the nation, right? Excellent. Good. So I'm glad we're hearing some people who are actually got together and said, yeah, we actually think we need to keep it, because there are good arguments on both sides, I think. Maybe that's because I'm a moderator, and to really be thinking about that. Was there any group that had strong disagreements within them? Wow, really? Did it really play out that you all just magically? This just makes me think even more about Zoom. I think they know quite a bit about us before we actually get onto these calls. And then they direct us exactly where they think we want to be. It's like that algorithm. Truly, there was no group that got together and said, actually, I think we should keep it, and I think we should get rid of it, and that you guys, I don't know, what did you do? Do thumb wrestling or arm wrestling, or is it those groups, one person has just left?
We just, it seemed like we needed a little more time to digest all the arguments that were presented by you. And so we just kind of threw stuff around. We're a bit torn. I mean, it's a complicated question.
Yeah.
What are the outcomes that we really want? So people wanted a feeling of unity with the result of the vote, and that everybody's vote should count, whether you're in Little Vermont or California, your vote, or a swing state, your vote should feel important. So how do you achieve that? And also ensuring that the idea that we're a federation, that the states and the regions really have some purchase still. The identity of a state remains intact, even though one person, one vote makes a lot of sense. So how do you keep votes meaningful, and also have it ensure that the candidates visit every state, because every state really is important, instead of just assuming certain states.
Right.
So the ball was still up in the air. But it sounded like more on the affirmative side, and yet there's a lot at stake in abandoning their unforeseen, unintentional consequences to abolishing. It could be really serious.
Right, exactly. And go ahead, Andrew.
I just had a question about the Vernon Jordan statement that there would be then a black party, and so there'd be a lot of splinter parties. Could you flesh that out a little, why that would happen?
Sure. I mean, I think his concern in 1979, and if we think about where were the parties and how were the parties aligning themselves, this is after Nixon has used the Southern strategy, where the Republican Party was in a position where they were using, I want to say, nativism, racial fears amongst white voters. And so that became a moment when people who were working on the civil rights movement, such as Vernon Jordan, were trying to figure out how could they play well in this system. And if they got rid of the Electoral College and parties stopped being as important, Vernon Jordan and other civil rights leaders were concerned that there wouldn't be coalition building. But the parties needed coalition building, and in order to do that coalition building, they were going to need to make concessions. And so that was some of the thinking behind that.
Right. Incidentally, one more question. You said that George Wallace was stopped by the Democratic Party. Was that the gatekeeper function there, or how did that work?
Yeah. So the Democrats, as they saw George Wallace, really 40% approval rating for a avowed segregationist in the United States running for president, 40% approval rating, and he was using a lot of the techniques the populist candidates use, and the Democratic Party went, nope, you're not getting any further. Knowing, now, he also I think, suffered an assassination attempt, and that also slowed him down. But according to these two political scientists, that was crucial. Yeah, so I'm interested in the fact that so far, at least, I haven't heard anybody, particularly given what happened in this past election, that the idea of a national recount didn't make you want to run out of the room screaming.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so Janice, do you want to say anything
Yeah,
about that?
I agree. I cringed at that one and thought that that was really a weak argument.
You did.
Yeah,
Because you
I mean, well, we've practically had a national recount this year. You know, that seemed like a false reason to justify retaining it.
Interesting.
Yeah, to me
Interesting.
anyway.
Yeah.
That was my
Yeah.
response. And yeah, I just wanted to comment when you were talking about George Wallace, you know, and the Democratic Party pushing back. When Trump was running, there were definitely a lot of no Trumpists, but the Republican, maybe because they never believed that he would win, but they did not want him to be their candidate, yet they did not step up and push back when they saw, and he was close to 40%, 35 or something, you know.
That
So I
was
think
one.
there's such historical context for all of this here.
Yeah.
That
So your
was
point,
one of-
Janice, is well taken. Joyce, I'll let you have a say, and then I want to get at that a little bit, because the role of the Republican Party in the rise of Trumpism is of great concern. Yeah, Joyce.
Yeah, well, that was one of my things in our breakout. I said that I wrote when they wrote, said it prevented him from becoming president. And I think, well, it works both ways. It didn't prevent Trump from becoming president, but yeah, it prevented Wallace. So the argument only works if it's the person that you don't want to become president. The argument doesn't hold water on the other side. I think you need an argument. If you're going to argue for something, you've got to argue where it really fits both sides of the coin, of both sides that are trying to finding why it's good or bad.
So in our group, we
Thank you, Joyce, for that. To get at this, and I'm going to open this up into a slightly broader concern, because that's, I think, and I want to make sure I heard Joyce correctly. But if we are understanding democracy, and I'll go back to Hamilton, that if democracy's greatest threat is a demagogue, then we've had in the United States the rise of, and I'm not trying to say this in a partisan way, I'm saying this much more as a political scientist, of that there is a certain strategy of appealing to the population at large, which is anti-democratic. And we continuously in this country run into the situation where somebody is anti-democratic. What's surprising is perhaps it hasn't happened that many times. So I think the nation as a whole, and certainly since January 6th, I think has a greater understanding of how authoritarianism takes place in a country through the electoral method. So so I'm going to play around with this a little bit, that if democracies are at risk of demagogues, now the fact that 40% of the population, and that Trump did very, very well in this last election, is not to say, I have to be very careful about this, it's not to say that many people didn't find good reasons to vote for Trump over Biden. The piece that as members of a democracy we always have to think about is, what do we do though when somebody gets into power and begins to say things like, well, actually, I'm going to just stay in power for as long as I wish. Those are the sort of things that people who are studying democracy across the world say, no. You cannot start talking as if you are not subject to elections. You cannot start talking as if your understanding of the truth is not up for verification. So I'm making a different argument than policy or what was on the platform. So what is going to happen in the United States to make sure that democracy and stays vibrant. So I wanted to bring on some other slides, but before I go to this other slide, which means I'm going to open up this picture much broader, in which the concern is how does the Electoral College help us have a stronger democracy, knowing that the Electoral College may need some changes, may need some tweaks. But before I go into that larger piece, I had some great questions here. And first was, before we went on breakout room, who determines when the Electoral College meets? That is in Article 2. Don't you love it that this Constitution is so tiny? You can just go to it. It doesn't take me that long. Article 2, Section 4, the Congress may determine the time of choosing the electors and the day on which they shall give their vote, which day shall be the same throughout the United States. So that is an answer to your question. And also, Jack Wool, can we not amend the Constitution to direct states to split their electoral vote? And that's what Bill, I think, was talking about from that breakout group. Can we think about making changes to the Electoral College, not to get rid of it, because it's going to be hard to do a constitutional change, but to recognize, to do it more of a, as Maine and Nebraska do. Okay, so
I guess I'm wrong.
I'm going to make a case for the Electoral College people, knowing that many of you wish to put it down, take it out back, do terrible things to it. I understand that. And so I'm going to make my case and then make a couple of suggestions on what we should do about it. The first case is, I think it's true that coalitions are essential. If we look at what happened in France, when there was the rise of the extreme right party, and France was needing to figure out what were they going to do, it required a broad coalition. Now, if you don't love Macron, I'm not going to be making a case that makes you totally happy. But if you also were concerned about extreme right-wing nationalists in France, then the fact that the parties in France worked together, created a coalition across political lines was essential. This is how, if you're dealing with authoritarian tendencies, it seems to be the only solution. So let me just share a couple more slides with you. I'll make my case and let's see, going here and share. So we're moving beyond Vernon Jordan, going back to this book. The two things they're suggesting. The strength of the American political system rests on the principles of individual freedom and egalitarianism. That's all in our founding documents. We get it in the Declaration of Independence, and we get it in the preamble to the Constitution, and specifically in the 14th Amendment, that whole thing about equal protection under the law. Now, these strengths, they say, are self-justifying, but they are not self-executing. We may have a high degree of interest in protecting individual freedoms, but if our system cannot withstand authoritarianism, then we don't have a chance. And so their main recommendation is mutual toleration and institutional forbearance. Our procedural principles, they tell politicians how to behave beyond the bounds of law to make our institutions function. This may seem strange to say in 2021 in the United States of America, to suggest that mutual toleration and institutional forbearance are the right ways to go. But I recommend this book and taking a look at it. And they're talking specifically about what is going to be on the shoulders of the Democrats going forward. And their recommendation is, if Democrats do not work to restore norms of mutual toleration and forbearance, their next president, which turned out to be Joe Biden, will likely confront an opposition willing to use any means necessary to defeat them. and that the most effective coalitions are those that bring together groups with dissimilar, even opposing views on many issues. So it's not enough just to use your regular base within the Democratic Party. In order to actually counter an authoritarian tendency, there has to be even broader coalitions. This means temporarily overlooking disagreements in order to find common moral ground. So for them, what they want to see is Democrats working with what you might call business Republicans or moderate Republicans. And otherwise, it seems quite likely that more authoritarian forms of power will come to pass. So one other solution besides using parties to form broad coalitions comes out of the American Academy of Arts and Science. They published this in the summer of 2020, and this is something you can find online. It's called Our Common Purpose. If you just plug in Our Common Purpose in Google, you'll probably find it. And their first suggestion, they have 6 pillars that they want us to work on improving our American democracy. And the first one is to substantially enlarge the House of Representatives through federal legislation that does not require a constitutional amendment, to make it and the Electoral College more representative of the nation's population. As Peter Zamor was saying earlier about the population ratios between small states and big states, that ratio is supposed to get even worse by 2040, 77-1. So they suggest change the House of Representatives, and you change the Electoral College, and like was it Jack, Wool, and Bill, get rid of winner take all results. So you'll find that strategy is suggested as well. And that here's the key piece, people. This is where we have to get back to being able to talk to people you may not agree with. The ratio of the population, figuring out that calculation between the number of people within a state and how many seats in Congress they should have, must be determined by rigorous dialogue and debate. So that's my argument. Don't get rid of it. Make changes. Be willing to strategize with people you may not agree with on everything. Key piece of building a broad coalition is you need to find that you may disagree on some issues and you can find other issues to agree on. I do think authoritarianism is a problem right now in the 21st century. I assume that this will increase. Democracies are under attack all over the world. And so I'm hoping that you will find reasons to think about making common cause through deliberation and not go for hardball politics, which is usually where it gets worse and worse and worse. And then, unfortunately, we get rulers who are not interested in sharing power. So that's my point. And we do have some time for any questions or people who wish to say, Meg, you got to read some other books because you are coming up with terrible ideas. Yes.
I
Bob.
don't want you to read another book. I just have a question. The issue came up about, in the unlikely event we get rid of the Electoral College, there would be some unintended consequences. Could you tell us what you think might be the greatest unintended consequences?
Well, I can't remember the gentleman's name, but I am, first of all, very concerned about any possibility of further concentration of power in just a few regions of the United States.
Okay.
So, because if you get rid of it's going to be very hard. I think it's probably a fool's errand, but to actually get rid of the Electoral College, because that will require a constitutional amendment. But a lot of political scientists who have studied other countries when you have the capacity for concentration of power, one group gets in, one faction, and then they tend to dominate everything. And minority voices are taken out quite quickly.
Okay.
So I mentioned France as on the risky side there for a little while, Venezuela, Turkey, other places where Putin was elected, and we're watching how he just takes out any kind of dissent.
Right.
And that's because he can rule everything from Moscow.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you
So, yeah,
for that.
I'm all for Sherry. Yes.
Yes, can you explain a little bit more about that and how the Electoral College reduces the risk of concentration of power? Because even with the Electoral College, you have these swing states that are hugely important. You have California that has 55 electoral votes. And so can you just flesh that out a little bit more for us, please?
Yeah, so this is where I do think, and this is what Peter Seymour brought up earlier, I do think we're going to need to do something about mass difference in terms of voting power. Vermont is in a very lovely situation right now. California is not. So there's going to need to be some other calculations. You can't have 10,000 people in the House of Representatives. So this is going to be complicated. How can we have a representative body that's still manageable, but does not reduce the voice of people in California? So that's a big problem that's going to have to be solved. But I guess what I want to say is I think it's a noble problem. It's something that perhaps all Americans could think about. It's the type of issue, unlike what have been our most divisive issues? Usually it has to do with race or religion, life and death. Those are where people feel like, I can't even talk to you about this. But if we can talk about math, if we can talk about what seems fair, people, for actually creating a more just system, I feel like that's a good conversation for us to have. So I'm hoping that by even starting to think we could have that conversation, we might be willing to think of other options. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah, Sarah.
I don't know if it's a full question, but was there any language around diplomacy in like when the Electoral College, because I know we tend, like, I mean, diplomacy, we look at more like foreign relations, but was there any kind of language embedded into like, you know, the making of the Electoral College with that?
Can you tell us a little bit more what you mean by diplomacy? I want to just make
well,
sure.
Like, because it seems like what you're suggesting, which makes sense, is like we should be able to have discourse and debate and be able to. So it's like when we think about, like when I think about diplomacy, or like when I have conversations about diplomacy, it's always about foreign diplomacy, right? Like how is the U.S., you know, how are we getting along, or, you know, what's our relationship with other countries? But like, if like, do we have that same language somewhere in our constitution, especially with around the whole Electoral College, elections about diplomacy, like within our country?
Right. Well, I think diplomacy is a beautiful word because it means how do you speak well to somebody else with enough respect that they feel like they can hear you. And Hamilton originally thinks that, well, maybe people will deliberate. And as Christina said earlier, if you take people off into a quieter place within each state, maybe they will actually be able to talk to each other in a better way. It's like the difference between our breakout rooms and trying to do the whole thing en masse. So there is something, I think, in the psychology of the Electoral College. Now, the problem is right now, and maybe that, I mean, we could say that's a good thing. Why do we want all these wise guys to be the ones to tell us what it is, what's in our best interests? So that's, you know, is somewhat problematic. But I do think the idea within parties, now parties have to get stronger. Parties need to actually do that hard work, to deliberate within, to talk to their different groups. to come up with ways that not everybody's going to be happy with, but there's going to be a solution. So I feel like diplomacy is a great word that you're bringing into this, Sarah. Yeah. Parties should be doing more about that and less about hardball politics. Even though it's tempting. Yeah.
And then on that same vein, I'm curious, like, since it was written, especially with the whole 3/5, thing, that's a very, it's kind of hard to kind of get away from that language, especially how, like, there's so much argument around the Electoral College and, like, just the Constitution in general, like, about how its antiquity and all that, but just like acknowledging that, like, it was written to reflect that time, and then like basically just honoring that language, and then being able to get out of that language to Electoral College differently.
Right. So this would need to be part of what some people are calling a third Reconstruction. The first Reconstruction that got rid of the 3/5 clause, and that was undone basically because the Grant's party just did not have it in them, to the Republican Party, to really protect African Americans in the South and in other states as well. So, and then there's the second Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Movement. So many people are talking right now about the third Reconstruction, and that seems absolutely right. And President Biden has just put that as a high priority, how to address that. I don't want to make it sound like it's going to be easy, but these are the sort of conversations that parties should be having who want to actually broaden their base. I am somebody who believes that the Republican Party and conservative movement still has a place in the United States, and that I think it can be very successful if it's able to broaden its language and not take these hardball nationalist, ethnic nationalist ways of doing things. So I think one more question, and we're getting some great links here that people are suggesting of things to look at. Brooklyn would have the same electoral power as New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maine combined. Yeah, right. We got to solve this problem somehow. Janice, I think you had your hand up, and that'll be the last question.
Yeah, I'd like to, obviously your solutions are very wonderful and idealistic and positive, and I'd like to explore the concept of powerful coalitions, what that really looks like, because I believe even in the last Congress, we did see some coalitions around COVID and other, in smaller areas, you would hear about things that happened, but none of that affected the person that was in charge. None of that pushed back on that or changed the autocracy that he was trying to have, and could have, if he won, would have continued. So what kind of coalitions can you have that are going to be effective enough to change that person's behavior or get him out of there if his party isn't willing to dump him?
I think the question for the Republican Party right now is going to be, will they be taken over by what's called Trumpism, or will they work to against that? And I do think in order for the Republican Party to succeed, that they are going to need to form broader coalitions outside of the tent that they had marked out for themselves, using some of that nativist strategies.
You mean within their own party or with the Democrats?
Within their own party, but then they're going to need to, in order to bring health back to their party, they're going to need to find common cause with Democrats. And I'm hoping Democrats, and it looks like that's happening in the Senate right now, that some Democrats are working with Republicans. I personally, and I speak for myself, I always say it's better not to do the scorched earth form of politics. Because when you do that, that's how in many of these countries, one side comes in and goes slam, the other side says we're going to take care of you by slamming them. And that's why mutual toleration, institutional forbearance, and I'm not just saying this by opinion, this is by watching what's happened to other democracies, that seems to be a winning strategy. Or not.
What about more parties?
That's another possibility.
No.
Yeah.
Could I
Yeah.
squeeze in one last thought?
One last thought.
I didn't think of it while we were in our breakout groups, but in the vein of unintended consequences, even though our group was in favor of getting rid of the Electoral College, if we did go to a strictly popular vote, would that probably imply that the control of the individual states would have to be given up in favor of having identical rules and process every state would have to follow?
Barb, thank you so much. That's really the question for the evening is, if we get rid of the Electoral College, are we moving to a nation without states, where we're not a United States of America, we are Americans. And yes, then we lose our individual experiments as states to solve different problems in different ways. So that it's moving more towards a national political system and less of a federal system.